Arizona Territory, 1852. The rifle's weight felt familiar in Grace Adams' hands as she counted her remaining bullets. 7. 7 chances to defend what was hers. The sound of hoofbeats approached from the south trail, and she narrowed her eyes against the copper light of dawn streaking across the Arizona desert. Another unwelcome visitor, no doubt. Another man come to tell her that a woman couldn't possibly run a ranch alone. "Looks like Randall James's boy," called Hank from the corral, his weathered face creased with concern. The elderly ranch hand was the only one who'd stayed after Thomas died, the only one who believed in her stubborn dream. Grace tucked a stray lock of golden-brown hair beneath her hat. "Let me guess. Another generous offer for my water rights. You want me to send him packing?" Hank asked, hand drifting to the revolver at his hip. "No," Grace replied, steel in her voice. "I'll handle this myself." At 24, Grace had already weathered more storms than most women twice her age, leaving her Virginia home as a hopeful bride, building this ranch from nothing with Thomas, and now, 3 years a widow, fighting daily to hold on to the only thing she had left, this modest spread her husband had died defending during the Mexican War. "Mrs. Adams," called the young man as he dismounted, his expensive leather boots raising small clouds of dust. "My father sends his regards." Grace didn't bother with pleasantries. "I'll save us both some time, Mr. James. My answer hasn't changed. This ranch isn't for sale, not at any price." The man's cordial smile hardened. "Ma'am, my father asked me to remind you that the banknote comes due next month. Without a successful cattle drive, how do you plan to meet your obligations?" It was a question that kept Grace awake most nights, but she'd die before showing weakness to Randall James's son. "That's my concern, not yours. Now state your business or move along." As the messenger delivered yet another insultingly low offer, Grace's mind drifted to the problems that had been mounting like storm clouds. 3 cattle missing yesterday, making 15 this month. Her dwindling herd couldn't withstand many more losses. "My father isn't a patient man," the young man concluded, mounting his horse. "Think carefully about your future, Mrs. Adams. A woman alone in these parts faces dangers." After he'd ridden away, Hank approached, spitting in the dust. "One day I'm going to forget my manners around that bunch." 3 more cattle gone," Grace said, changing the subject. "Found tracks leading north toward Apache territory." Hank's expression darkened. "Them Indians been getting bolder. Might be time to organize a posse with the neighboring ranches." "The same neighbors who've been trying to run me off my land?" Grace shook her head. "Besides, something doesn't add up. Why would Apache take just 3 cattle at a time? Why not the whole herd?" "Don't try to make sense of Indian ways," Hank warned. "Thomas always said you had too much trust in folks." The mention of her husband's name sent the familiar pang through Grace's heart. "Thomas also believed in justice. I won't blame anyone without proof." Inside the modest ranch house, Grace opened the carved wooden chest where she kept Thomas's Winchester rifle. The smooth walnut stock felt foreign in her hands, but she'd taught herself to shoot in the long, empty evenings. Not well, perhaps, but well enough to make noise and scare off trouble. That night, sleep eluded her as it often did. Through the open window, the desert whispered its ancient secrets. The soft hoot of an owl, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustling of wind through the sparse vegetation. She rose before dawn, dressed in her practical work clothes, a simple blouse and skirt, sturdy boots, her hair tied back beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and headed to the corral to check on her diminishing herd. 3 more cattle missing. The tracks led toward the rocky foothills to the north, where the Apache were said to make their camps. With determination hardening her features, Grace saddled her mare, slipped Thomas's rifle into its leather scabbard, and followed the trail alone. Hank had taken the wagon to town for supplies, and she wouldn't wait. The sun climbed higher as she tracked the cattle across increasingly difficult terrain. Her mare picked its way carefully through the rocky landscape, ears pricked forward nervously. Grace felt exposed, vulnerable, but her stubborn pride drove her forward. This land, these cattle, were all she had left. As she rounded a bend in a narrow canyon, she spotted him, a lone figure on horseback, silhouetted against the harsh blue sky. An Apache warrior, watching her from the ridge above. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as she pulled the rifle from its scabbard and raised it with trembling hands. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice echoing against the canyon walls. "Leave me in peace. Stop stealing from my ranch and taking my animals." The Apache remained silent, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his headband. Then, unexpectedly, he turned his horse and began riding directly toward her. "Stop!" Grace called out, panic rising in her throat. "I said stop!" But he continued approaching, his dark eyes fixed intently on her face. "I'll shoot!" she warned, the rifle shaking visibly in her grasp. Still, he came, his horse moving at a steady walk until he was barely 20 feet away. Grace's finger hovered over the trigger, but fear paralyzed her. The warrior was close enough now that she could see the intricate patterns painted on his face, the eagle feather tied in his long black hair, the proud set of his shoulders. "I come in peace," he said in perfect, accented English that shocked her almost as much as his approach. "It is not I who takes your cattle, it is the white man." Grace stared, momentarily speechless. You speak English?" "I am Dohasan," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "Leader of the young hunters among my people. You expect me to believe you're not behind the thefts?" Grace kept the rifle raised, though her arms ached with the effort. Dohasan's gaze was steady. "I have watched your ranch. 3 men come at night. White men. They take your cattle north, not to Apache lands." He pointed toward distant mountains. "They go there, to the hidden canyon where water flows year-round. I can show you, but you should lower your weapon. It offends me." Something in his dignity, his calm assurance made Grace slowly lower the rifle, though she kept it ready. "Why would you help me?" she asked suspiciously. A hint of something, amusement, perhaps, flickered across his stoic features. "Your husband was fair to my people. He gave medicine when our children were sick with the white man's disease. We have not forgotten." Before Grace could respond, Dohasan turned his horse and began riding away. "Wait!" she called after him. "How do you know about my husband?" But Dohasan merely raised his hand in farewell and disappeared around the bend, leaving Grace alone with her confusion and the unsettling realization that the Apache had been watching her ranch, watching her, for far longer than she'd imagined. That night, as darkness settled over the land, Grace sat on her porch with the rifle across her lap, replaying the strange encounter in her mind. Could she trust the Apache's words, or was this some elaborate trap? Around midnight, the sound of approaching hoofbeats brought her to her feet. 3 shadowy riders approached the cattle pen from the south, the opposite direction from the Apache lands. Grace raised her rifle, ready to defend what was hers, when suddenly war cries split the night air. From the darkness emerged a lone rider, moving with incredible speed. Dohasan. The thieves scattered in panic, abandoning their attempt on her cattle. One of them fired wildly into the darkness, but Dohasan seemed to melt into the shadows, appearing and disappearing like a desert spirit as he chased the men away from the ranch. Grace stood transfixed, realizing with a mixture of humiliation and gratitude that the Apache had been telling the truth. He hadn't been stealing from her. He'd been protecting her property. When the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, Grace lowered her rifle and whispered into the empty night, "Thank you." She couldn't be certain, but as a cool breeze swept across the porch, she thought she heard a whispered reply, "You are welcome, brave one." For 3 days following the night raid, Grace saw no sign of Dohasan, though she often felt the weight of unseen eyes watching the ranch. She found herself scanning the ridgelines, wondering if he was there, a silent guardian maintaining his vigil. The knowledge that someone was protecting her, an Apache warrior of all people, stirred conflicting emotions she couldn't quite name. On the 4th morning, as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Grace discovered a freshly killed deer laid carefully beside the water trough, a peace offering, or perhaps a statement that he could come and go as he pleased without detection. The latter thought sent a shiver down her spine that wasn't entirely fear. "Apache work," Hank observed gruffly when she showed him the deer. "Cleanest kill I've seen in years." "Dohasan," Grace said softly, touching the animal's flank. "It's still warm." Hank's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "You're on a first-name basis with him now?" Grace felt a flush creep into her cheeks. "He told me his name when I encountered him, and he's the one who drove off those thieves." "Don't mean you can trust him," Hank warned, though his tone lacked conviction. "Apache got their own reasons for everything they do." "Then I intend to find out what those reasons are," Grace replied, her mind already made up. "Help me butcher this deer, Hank. We're having company for dinner." That evening, as twilight painted the desert in shades of purple and gold, Grace prepared a stew from the deer meat. She set 2 bowls on the rough-hewn table on her porch, one for herself and one for the visitor she somehow knew would come. "You're playing with fire," Hank muttered as he retreated to his small cabin near the barn. "Thomas would have had my hide for letting you do this." "Thomas isn't here," Grace replied, more sharply than she intended. Seeing the hurt in the old man's eyes, she softened. "I need answers, Hank, and I need allies if I'm going to save this ranch." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, a silhouette materialized from the shadows. Dohasan approached cautiously, his movements fluid and silent, until he stood at the edge of the porch steps. The fading light accentuated the sharp planes of his face, the proud set of his shoulders. Grace's breath caught in her throat at the raw power of his presence. "You have prepared food," he observed, his eyes moving from the steaming bowls to Grace's face. "From your deer," she acknowledged, willing her voice to remain steady. "Among my people, it's customary to share a meal with someone who has done you a kindness." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "Among my people as well." He ascended the steps with the measured dignity that seemed to characterize his every movement and seated himself across from her. In the lantern light, Grace studied him openly for the first time. His features were strong and proud, high cheekbones, a straight nose, eyes dark and intelligent beneath a commanding brow. He wore a buckskin shirt adorned with intricate beadwork, and a necklace of what appeared to be bear claws hung at his throat. "Are you staring?" he said without looking up from his food. Grace flushed. "I apologize. I've never shared a meal with an Apache before, and I have rarely broken bread with a white woman who did not tremble at my presence." He met her gaze directly. "You are afraid, but you do not show it. This is courage." "I'm not sure it's courage so much as necessity," Grace replied. "Fear is a luxury I can't afford anymore." They ate in silence for a time, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the night insects beginning their chorus. "How did you learn to speak English so well?" Grace finally asked. Dohasan set down his spoon. "I was taken to the white man's school when I was a boy. 10 summers I lived among your people, learning your ways, your words, your writing. And then you returned to your tribe." A shadow crossed his face. "They tried to make me forget who I was. I refused. When I was strong enough, I escaped and found my way home." His voice hardened. "They had told my family I was dead." Grace felt a pang of shame for what her people had done. "I'm sorry. It was long ago," Dohasan said, though his eyes suggested the wounds remained fresh. "The experience gave me knowledge of 2 worlds. This has made me valuable to my people as the white settlers push farther into our lands." "Is that why you protected my cattle? To maintain peace between our peoples?" Dohasan considered her question. "Partly, but also because I watched you after your husband died. Many white women would have fled back east. You stayed and fought. This deserves respect." An uncomfortable warmth spread through Grace at his words. She hadn't received respect from anyone. Not the townspeople with their pitying glances, not the neighboring ranchers with their insulting offers, not even Hank, loyal though he was, who constantly questioned her decisions. "The men who tried to steal your cattle," Dohasan continued, "they work for the man with many cattle and the big white house." "Randall James," Grace said bitterly. "He wants my land." "Why?" "Water rights." "My husband was smart. He secured rights to the spring that feeds the Eastern Valley. James wants to control all the water in the county." She sighed. "And he can't abide a woman refusing him anything." Dohasan nodded in understanding. Such men exist in all tribes. They believe their strength gives them the right to take what belongs to others. "And what do you believe?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. His dark eyes held hers. "I believe that true strength lies in protecting what is precious, not in conquering it." The conversation shifted to practical matters, the security of the ranch, the movements of James's men, the changing seasons, and what they would bring. Grace was surprised by Dohasan's tactical mind and his deep knowledge of the territory. As the evening progressed, she realized they had more in common than she would have ever imagined. Both outsiders in their own way, both fighting to preserve their way of life against forces that would crush them without a second thought. When Dohasan finally rose to leave, Grace found herself reluctant to see him go. "Will you come again?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. He studied her face in the lantern light. "If you wish it." "I do," she said simply. He nodded once, then melted back into the darkness from which he had emerged, leaving Grace with a strange mixture of emotions she couldn't begin to untangle. The following weeks established a pattern. Dohasan would appear every few days, sometimes bringing game, other times simply offering his company. Grace learned about his people, their customs, their struggles, their deep connection to the land. In turn, she shared stories of her life before Arizona, of the small Virginia town where she'd grown up, of meeting Thomas and their journey west full of dreams and ambitions. Hank observed these visits with obvious disapproval, but kept his peace, seemingly more concerned about Grace's isolation than her unusual friendship. The old ranch hand had his own prejudices, but he'd fought alongside Mexicans in the war and had learned that courage and loyalty weren't confined to any one race. One evening, as Grace was returning from the creek with a basket of freshly washed linens, she spotted Dohasan's horse tethered in the shadow of the barn, an unprecedented daylight visit. She quickened her pace, a smile forming unbidden on her lips, only to stop short at the sight that greeted her in the yard. Dohasan stood toe-to-toe with Hank, both men rigid with tension. The old ranch hand's hand hovered near his holstered pistol, while Dohasan's fingers rested lightly on the knife at his belt. "What's happening here?" Grace demanded, setting down her basket. "Found him sneaking around the barn," Hank growled. "Man's got no business here in broad daylight." "I came to warn you," Dohasan said, his eyes never leaving Hank. "Soldiers are patrolling the foothills. They will reach this valley by nightfall." Grace moved between the two men. "Stand down, both of you." "Hank, Dohasan is my guest." "And Dohasan," she turned to the Apache, "next time announce yourself. These are dangerous times." The tension ebbed slowly as both men took reluctant steps backward. "What soldiers?" Grace asked, focusing on Dohasan's warning. "Cavalry, a full patrol led by a man with yellow hair and the markings of a lieutenant." Dohasan's expression was grim. "They are searching for Apache. They have burned 2 camps already." "Lieutenant Marshal," Hank muttered. "Mean piece of work. Got a reputation for not distinguishing between hostile and peaceful Indians." "You should go," Grace told Dohasan urgently. "If they find you here, I will go," he agreed. "But you should know. They do not patrol this area by chance. Someone has told them about me, about my visits here." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Grace glanced at Hank, who bristled visibly. "Now see here," the old man began, but Grace cut him off. "No one from this ranch has spoken to any soldiers," she said firmly. "But it doesn't matter how they know. What matters is keeping you safe." She turned to Dohasan. "Can you make it back to your people before the patrol arrives?" "Yes." He hesitated, then added, "But I may not return for some time. My band moves deeper into the mountains with the changing moon." The thought of not seeing him for weeks, perhaps months, sent an unexpected pang through Grace's heart. "I understand," she said, striving to keep her voice neutral. "Your safety must come first." Dohasan's eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he nodded to Hank, a gesture of truce, if not respect, and moved toward his horse. Grace followed him to the edge of the yard. "Be careful," she said softly, away from Hank's hearing. "And you," Dohasan replied. "The soldiers will ask questions. Tell them what you must to avoid suspicion." A rare smile touched his lips. "I will find my way back to you, Grace Adams." It was the first time he had used her name, and the sound of it in his accented voice made her breath catch. Before she could respond, he had mounted and was riding away, his silhouette soon lost among the rocky outcroppings that bordered her land. Just as Dohasan had predicted, Lieutenant Marshall's patrol arrived as the sun was setting. 6 cavalrymen, trail-worn and dusty, their blue uniforms stained with the red soil of the territory. Marshall himself was a lean, hard-faced man with cold eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mrs. Adams," he said, removing his hat with a courtesy that didn't reach his gaze. "We're patrolling for hostile Apache in the area. Mind if we water our horses and ask you a few questions?" Grace gestured to the trough. "Help yourselves, Lieutenant." "Though I'm surprised to see the army this far from the fort." Marshall dismounted, his spurs jingling in the dust. "We go where the hostiles are, ma'am, and we have reliable information that a particularly dangerous Apache has been seen in this vicinity." His eyes narrowed slightly. A renegade who speaks English goes by the name Dohasan. Grace kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will. I can't say I've heard the name. Most of the Apache keep to the high country, especially with winter coming on. Most do, Marshall agreed. But this one's different. Educated at a government school before he turned savage again, makes him unpredictable, dangerous. He studied her face. You sure you haven't seen any sign of Indians around your ranch, Mrs. Adams? No missing livestock? No tracks? I've lost some cattle, Grace admitted, but I caught the thieves in the act a few weeks back. White men, Lieutenant. Working for a neighboring rancher who's been trying to force me off my land. Marshall's eyebrows rose. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime, Grace countered. One I'd appreciate the Army's help with, rather than chasing shadows in the hills. A muscle twitched in Marshall's jaw. The Army's primary concern is the safety of settlers, Mrs. Adams, including widows living alone in Apache territory. The condescension in his tone made Grace's temper flare. I'm quite capable of looking after myself, Lieutenant. My husband taught me well before he died fighting for this country. The mention of her husband's military service gave Marshall pause. Your husband was a soldier? Volunteer cavalry, Grace replied. Killed at Buena Vista. A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed Marshall's face. I was at Buena Vista. Nasty business. He replaced his hat. Well, Mrs. Adams, we won't trouble you further tonight. But my patrol will be in this area for some time. If you see anything suspicious, I expect you to report it immediately. Of course, Lieutenant, Grace agreed, relief making her light-headed. Good hunting. As the soldiers watered their horses, one of the younger men approached the porch where Grace stood watching. He was barely more than a boy with earnest eyes and a face still rounded with youth. Ma'am, he said hesitantly, I don't mean to frighten you, but you really ought to be careful. That Apache the lieutenant mentioned, he's dangerous. Killed 2 settlers up north last spring. Grace frowned. How do you know it was him? Survivor's description, the young soldier replied. Said he spoke perfect English and had a bear claw necklace. Not many Apache fit that description. The bear claw necklace, the same one Dohasan wore. Grace's mind raced. Could it be true? Had she been sharing meals with a killer? But somehow the accusation rang false. Dohasan had had countless opportunities to harm her if that had been his intention. I'll be vigilant, she assured the soldier. Thank you for the warning. After the patrol departed, Hank emerged from the barn where he'd been deliberately making himself scarce. They bought your story, he observed. For now. They'll be back, Grace said, staring at the dust cloud raised by the departing horses. And next time they might not be so easily satisfied. Hank shifted uncomfortably. About your Apache friend? He has a name, Hank. About Dohasan, then, Hank amended. That young soldier's story. I don't believe it, Grace said firmly. If Dohasan wanted to harm settlers, why protect our cattle? Why warn us about the patrol? It doesn't make sense. Unless he's using you, Hank suggested. Gaining your trust for some purpose we don't understand. The thought had occurred to Grace as well, but she pushed it aside. I trust my instincts. And my instincts say he's a good man caught in a bad situation, just like us. Hank sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. Just be careful, Mrs. Adams. The territory ain't kind to those who make the wrong friends. True to Dohasan's prediction, he did not return in the days that followed. Grace found herself watching the horizon more often than she should, hoping for a glimpse of his distinctive silhouette against the sky. The ranch seemed emptier somehow, the silence more profound, without the anticipation of his visits. Lieutenant Marshall's patrol returned twice more, each time with more pointed questions and thinly veiled suspicions. Grace maintained her ignorance about any Apache in the area, but she could tell the officer's patience was wearing thin. A week turned into 2, then 3. The nights grew colder as autumn deepened toward winter. Grace threw herself into the work of preparing the ranch for the coming season, repairing fences, smoking meat, sealing the cabin against drafts. The physical labor helped distract her from thoughts of Dohasan, but in the quiet evenings, his absence was a tangible ache. One crisp morning, as Grace was chopping wood behind the house, a rider approached from the direction of town. She recognized him as Sam Tucker, who ran the general store and occasionally carried mail from the territorial capital. "Morning, Mrs. Adams," he called, dismounting stiffly. "Got something for you." He handed her an official-looking envelope bearing the seal of the Territorial Bank. Grace's stomach knotted as she broke the seal and read the contents. The bank was calling in her loan, 60 days to pay in full or forfeit the ranch. "Bad news?" Sam asked, noting her expression. "Just business," Grace replied, folding the letter carefully. "Thanks for bringing it out, Sam." After the storekeeper departed, Grace sat heavily on the chopping block, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. She had known this day might come, had been preparing for it as best she could, but without a successful cattle drive there was no way she could raise the money needed to satisfy the bank. That night, she sat on her porch long after Hank had retired, staring at the stars and wondering if somewhere under the same vast sky, Dohasan was looking up as well. The thought brought both comfort and a fresh wave of longing that surprised her with its intensity. A soft sound from the darkness brought her instantly alert. She reached for the rifle that was never far from her side these days, then froze as a familiar silhouette emerged from the shadows. "Dohasan," she breathed, rising to her feet. He climbed the steps in one fluid motion, stopping just before her. In the moonlight, his face seemed leaner, more angular, as if the weeks away had honed him to an even sharper edge. "I should not have come," he said quietly. "The soldiers still patrol these lands. But I needed to see that you were safe." "I'm fine," Grace said, suddenly conscious of her work-worn hands, her simple clothing, her hair hastily tied back after a long day of labor. "But you look tired." "My people move constantly now," he explained. "The army presses from the south, settlers from the east. We find less game, less safe ground with each passing moon." Without thinking, Grace reached out to touch his arm. "Come inside. I have food and you can rest a while." Dohasan hesitated, then nodded. Inside the small cabin, he seemed larger somehow, his presence filling the modest space. Grace busied herself preparing a simple meal, acutely aware of his eyes following her movements. "You are troubled," he observed as she set a plate before him. "More than my unexpected arrival." Grace sank into the chair opposite him. "The bank is foreclosing on the ranch. I have 60 days to pay a debt I have no hope of meeting. And then I lose everything." She gestured to the cabin around them. "This land, the cattle, the house Thomas and I built together, all of it gone." Dohasan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Among my people, when one family faces hunger, the tribe shares what they have. No one owns the land. It belongs to all, and to none. It's different for my people," Grace said sadly. "Land is everything. Status, security, future. Without it, I have nothing." "You have yourself," Dohasan replied simply. "Your courage, your skill, your strong heart. These cannot be taken by any bank." His words, spoken with such quiet certainty, eased something tight in Grace's chest. For the first time since receiving the letter, she felt as if she could breathe again. They talked late into the night, Dohasan sharing news of his people's movements, Grace updating him on the increased military presence in the area. Neither mentioned the growing tension between them, the unspoken current that seemed to draw them closer with each shared glance, each accidental touch. "I must go before dawn," Dohasan said, finally rising from his chair. "The soldiers patrol at first light." "When will I see you again?" Grace asked, following him to the door. He turned to face her, his expression solemn in the lamplight. "I do not know. My band travels far to the north with the winter moon. It may be many weeks before I can return." The thought of such a long separation sent a surge of emotion through Grace that she couldn't suppress. Without thinking, she stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Be safe," she whispered. Dohasan's hand came up to cover hers, warm and strong. For a breathless moment, they stood frozen in the intimate gesture, neither willing to break the connection. Then slowly, Dohasan raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "And you, brave one," he murmured. The tenderness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. This was dangerous territory they were entering, a path fraught with risks neither of them had acknowledged aloud. Yet in that moment, with his warm breath against her skin and his dark eyes holding hers, Grace couldn't bring herself to care about the consequences. Dohasan released her hand reluctantly and stepped back, as if needing physical distance to regain his composure. "I will find a way to help you keep your land," he promised. There must be a solution we have not yet seen. Grace shook her head. This is my burden to bear, not yours. Your people need you now more than ever. And you? Dohasan asked softly. What do you need, Grace Adams? The question hung in the air between them, laden with meanings neither was ready to voice. Grace looked away, unable to meet his intense gaze. I need time, she said finally. Time to find a way out of this trap. Dohasan nodded, accepting her answer, though his eyes suggested he heard the words she left unspoken. He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. Watch for the owl that hunts near your barn, he said. When you see it perched on your roof at dawn, know that I am returning to you. With that cryptic message, he slipped into the night, leaving Grace standing in the doorway, her hand still tingling from the press of his lips. As she prepared for bed, her mind raced with conflicting emotions. The practical part of her, the part shaped by Virginia propriety and frontier pragmatism, warned of the folly of developing feelings for an Apache warrior. Such a relationship would make her an outcast, despised by whites and distrusted by Indians alike. Yet another part of her, a part that had been awakening slowly since their first encounter, whispered that perhaps some connections transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture, that perhaps, in this vast and wild territory, two people could forge their own path outside the narrow constraints of society. Grace fell asleep with these thoughts swirling in her mind and dreamed of running free across endless plains, a strong hand clasped in hers, the wind carrying away all doubt and fear. The morning brought unwelcome reality in the form of Lieutenant Marshall and his patrol, this time accompanied by a civilian rider whom Grace recognized with a surge of anger, Bradley James, Randall James's oldest son and heir apparent to his ranching empire. Mrs. Adams, Lieutenant Marshall called as they rode into the yard. We need to have a word. Grace steeled herself, quickly assessing the situation. 6 soldiers, plus Bradley James, whose smug expression sent a flash of anger through her. She stepped off the porch, chin raised, deliberately leaving her rifle leaning against the wall behind her. Lieutenant, Mr. James, to what do I owe this visit? Her voice was cool, betraying none of the anxiety churning in her stomach. Bradley James dismounted with exaggerated elegance, his expensive boots raising puffs of dust. Unlike his younger brother, who at least attempted civility, Bradley made no effort to hide his contempt. Mrs. Adams, he drawled, removing his hat with mock courtesy. Always a pleasure to see how persistently you cling to this little patch of dirt. Grace ignored him, focusing on Marshall. What can I do for you, Lieutenant? Marshall remained mounted, looking down at her from his position of advantage. We've had reports of Apache movement in this area last night, specifically a lone rider spotted near your property. Grace's heart skipped a beat, but her expression remained impassive. I slept soundly, Lieutenant. Heard nothing unusual. Is that so? Bradley interjected. Because one of our ranch hands was returning from town late and swears he saw someone leaving your house in the dead of night. His smile was cruel. Not very proper behavior for a widow, is it? Your ranch hand is mistaken, Grace replied evenly. And I don't answer to you regarding my propriety, Mr. James. Lieutenant Marshall dismounted, his spurs jangling as he approached. Mrs. Adams, harboring hostiles is a serious offense. If you're protecting an Apache, I'm protecting nothing but my own livelihood, Grace interrupted, which becomes more difficult daily with these constant disruptions. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. We'll need to search your property. On what grounds? The security of the territory, ma'am. We don't need more grounds than that. Grace knew resistance would only heighten their suspicions. Fine. Search all you want. You'll find nothing but an honest ranch struggling to survive. She watched with clenched fists as the soldiers spread out across her property. 2 entered her house while others checked the barn, corral, and outbuildings. Bradley James remained in the yard, watching her with undisguised satisfaction. I understand the bank has called in your loan, he said casually. 60 days isn't much time to raise that kind of money. Grace's eyes snapped to his. How do you know about that? Bradley shrugged. Small territory, news travels. He lowered his voice. My father's offer still stands. It's not much, but it would give you enough to start over somewhere, more suitable for a woman alone. I'm not interested, Grace said coldly. You will be, Bradley replied with certainty, when the alternatives become clear. Before Grace could respond, one of the soldiers emerged from the barn holding something in his hand. With sinking horror, she recognized the intricate beaded wristband Dohasan had been wearing the night before. It must have come loose during his visit. "Lieutenant," the soldier called, "found this hidden under some straw." Marshall took the band, examining it, before turning to Grace with triumph in his eyes. "Apache craftsmanship. Care to explain this, Mrs. Adams?" Grace's mind raced. "I bought it in town," she said, the lie coming automatically. "From a Mexican trader. I have a weakness for native crafts." "A trader?" Marshall repeated skeptically. "And yet it was hidden in your barn, not displayed in your home." "I must have dropped it while doing chores," Grace improvised. "It's hardly evidence of anything sinister, Lieutenant." Bradley James stepped closer, his eyes cold. "Or perhaps it's a token from your Apache lover. Is that it, Mrs. Adams? Have you sunk so low as to consort with savages?" The accusation struck too close to the complicated truth. Grace felt heat rising to her face, not from shame, but from rage at his presumption. "That's enough, James," Marshall said sharply, surprising both of them. Whatever the lieutenant's suspicions, he apparently drew the line at such explicit accusations against a white woman. "Mrs. Adams, consider this a warning. If we find evidence that you're aiding hostiles, the consequences will be severe." He pocketed the wristband and signaled his men to mount up. "We'll be watching this ranch closely. For your own protection, of course." As they prepared to depart, Hank finally emerged from the fields where he'd been working, approaching with deliberate casualness. "Problem, Mrs. Adams?" he called, his hand resting near his holstered pistol. "No problem," Grace replied loudly. "The lieutenant and his men were just leaving." Marshall gave her one last measuring look before turning his horse. "Good day, Mrs. Adams. We'll speak again soon." Only after the patrol had disappeared from sight did Grace allow her shoulders to slump, the tension draining from her body, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "They found Dohasan's wristband," she told Hank quietly. "He was here last night." The old ranch hand's expression darkened. "That's twice now they've found evidence. Next time they might find him, or worse, shoot first and ask questions later." "He said he's heading north with his band," Grace said. "He won't be back for some time." "Good," Hank said firmly. "The further away he stays, the better for everyone." He studied her face, his eyes softening with concern. "Especially you." Grace turned away, unable to bear the understanding in his gaze. "I have work to do." The following days passed in a fog of worry and determination. Grace threw herself into ranch work with almost frantic energy, as if physical exhaustion might quiet her troubled thoughts. The bank's deadline loomed, and she explored every possible avenue to raise the money, selling off equipment she could barely spare, offering to break horses for neighboring ranches, even considering selling part of her herd at a loss. Nothing came close to the sum she needed. A week after the patrol's visit, Grace rode into town for supplies and to check for any mail. The general store fell silent as she entered, conversations halting mid-sentence. She felt the weight of stares as she made her way to the counter, where Sam Tucker waited, his expression uncomfortable. "Morning, Mrs. Adams," he said, his voice overly hearty. "What can I get for you today?" "Just the usual supplies, Sam," she replied, pretending not to notice the atmosphere. "And I'm expecting a letter from the territorial capital." Sam nodded, busying himself with gathering her items. "Heard you had some excitement out at your place," he ventured. "Army patrol found Indian things?" So the rumors had already spread. Grace kept her expression neutral. "A bit of beadwork I bought right here in town, as a matter of fact. Hardly cause for excitement." From the corner of the store, a harsh laugh sounded. Grace turned to see 3 cowboys from the James Ranch lounging against the wall, watching her with undisguised hostility. "That ain't what we heard," said the tallest one, a lanky man with a pockmarked face. "Heard you been consorting with Apache, inviting them into your home after dark." Grace felt a chill run down her spine, but she held her ground. "I don't answer to gossip, Mr. Carter." "Maybe not," Carter replied, pushing away from the wall to approach her. "But you answer to decent folks' concerns. Apache been raiding all through the territory, killing good people, and here you are playing house with one." "That's enough, Carter," Sam interrupted, his hand moving beneath the counter where Grace knew he kept a shotgun. "Mrs. Adams is a customer and a lady. You'll speak respectfully in my store." Carter spat on the floor. "Lady? That what we're calling squaw women now." The slur hung in the air like a physical thing. Grace's hand itched for her rifle, but she kept her voice steady. "I suggest you leave, Mr. Carter, before you say something that can't be taken back." For a tense moment, the cowboy seemed ready to escalate the confrontation. Then the store's door opened, and Sheriff Wilson stepped in, his weathered face taking in the scene with one glance. "Problem here, Sam?" he asked mildly, though his hand rested on his holstered pistol. "No problem, Sheriff," Sam replied quickly. Carter and his boys were just leaving. With a final venomous glare at Grace, Carter and the other cowboys pushed past the sheriff and out the door. Only then did Grace realize she'd been holding her breath. "You all right, Mrs. Adams?" the sheriff asked, approaching the counter. "Fine, thank you," she replied, willing her voice not to shake. Sheriff Wilson nodded, his expression grave. "Might want to be careful riding home alone. Those boys have been drinking since noon." "I can take care of myself," Grace assured him, though the warning sent a flutter of anxiety through her. The sheriff studied her face. "I've known you since you and Thomas first came to the territory. You've always been a good neighbor and an honest woman." He hesitated. "These rumors going around, I don't put much stock in gossip, but I'd be remiss not to mention that they're causing trouble." "What exactly are people saying?" Grace asked, dreading the answer. "That you've been seen with an Apache warrior, that he visits your ranch regular-like." The sheriff's eyes were kind but concerned. "I don't need to tell you how folks around here feel about Indians, especially with the raids up north. The Apache aren't a single people with a single mind," Grace said, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. "Some bands raid, others want peace. Just like some white men are honorable and others," she gestured toward the door where Carter had exited, "are not." "That's mighty enlightened thinking," the sheriff said carefully, "but not everyone shares it. Just be careful, Mrs. Adams. Arizona Territory ain't forgiving of those who stray too far from its unwritten rules." Grace completed her purchases in silence, the sheriff's warning echoing in her mind. As she loaded her supplies into her wagon, she noticed Carter and his companions watching from across the street, their expressions making their intentions clear. The road back to the ranch wound through several miles of isolated country. If they decided to follow her, Grace checked her rifle, making sure it was loaded and within easy reach. Then she climbed onto the wagon seat, took up the reins, and turned her team toward home, her spine straight and her eyes alert for any sign of pursuit. She was halfway back when she heard them, hoofbeats approaching fast from behind. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw Carter and his companions gaining rapidly, their horses at a gallop. Grace slapped the reins against her team's backs, urging them to greater speed, but the wagon was too heavily laden to outrun mounted pursuers. She reached for her rifle, prepared to make a stand if necessary, when suddenly a war cry split the air. From a rocky outcropping beside the road, a lone rider burst into view, his horse sailing over the stones like a creature born of the wind itself, Dohasan. He drove his mount directly at the pursuing cowboys, his very appearance so unexpected that they pulled up in confusion. Carter recovered first, reaching for his pistol, but Dohasan was already upon them. With a movement too swift to follow, he knocked the cowboy from his saddle, sending both man and gun tumbling into the dust. The other two hesitated, clearly unprepared for such fierce resistance. "Run!" Dohasan shouted at them, his voice carrying the full authority of a warrior chief. "Run back to your master and tell him the Apache watches over this woman." Something in his voice, perhaps the absolute certainty of violence if they remained, broke their nerve. Helping their cursing companion back onto his horse, they wheeled and galloped back toward town, throwing fearful glances over their shoulders. Grace pulled her wagon to a halt, her heart pounding as Dohasan rode to her side. His face was painted for war, stark lines of red and black accentuating his fierce features. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "No," she managed, still shaken by the suddenness of the attack and his appearance. "But you shouldn't be here. The army patrols this road." "I know," he said grimly. "I have been watching them watching you." His expression darkened. "The soldiers came to your ranch. They found my wristband." "Yes," Grace confirmed. "How did you know?" "I have been close by," Dohasan admitted. "My band travels north, but I could not leave while you were in danger." The realization that he had stayed behind, putting himself at risk for her safety, sent a wave of emotion through Grace that was too complex to name. "You can't stay," she said, though the words cost her. "The whole territory is looking for Apache, and now—" She gestured to the road where Carter and his companions had fled. "There will be more trouble." Dohasan's expression remained resolute. "I will not abandon you to your enemies." "These are not just my enemies," Grace insisted. "They're yours too, and they're more dangerous to you than to me." She took a deep breath. "Please, Dohasan, go to your people. They need you more than I do." Something flickered in his dark eyes, hurt perhaps, or a deeper understanding of what she was trying to say. After a long moment, he nodded once, a sharp gesture of acceptance, if not agreement. "I will go," he said. "But first I must show you something. Can you leave your wagon hidden and ride with me? It is not far." Grace hesitated, conscious of the risks, but also deeply curious. "For how long?" "We will return before nightfall," Dohasan promised. Making a swift decision, Grace guided her wagon off the main road and into a small copse of trees where it would be hidden from casual view. She unhitched one of her horses and mounted it bareback, securing her rifle across her back. "Lead on," she told Dohasan, settling herself for a ride without a proper saddle. He turned his horse toward the rugged hills that bordered the eastern edge of her property, setting a pace that was swift but considerate of her less comfortable riding position. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour, climbing steadily into increasingly rocky terrain until they reached a narrow pass between two towering buttes. "Through here," Dohasan directed, guiding his horse into the shadow of the pass. Grace followed, ducking low branches and marveling at how completely the narrow trail concealed their passage. The pass twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow that the horses had to proceed in single file, other times opening into small, sheltered valleys, lush with unexpected vegetation. Finally, they emerged onto a high plateau that offered a commanding view of the surrounding territory. Grace could see her ranch in the distance, a tiny island of cultivation in the vast wilderness. Beyond it lay the town, and further still the sprawling expanse of the James Ranch, its boundaries marked by the glint of sunlight on the river that served as its eastern border. "Look there," Dohasan said, pointing to a spot where the river narrowed between rocky banks. "What do you see?" Grace squinted against the sunlight. "A dam," she said, making out the man-made structure. "James is damming the river." Then the significance hit her. "He's diverting water from the eastern valley from my water rights." Dohasan nodded. "It began 2 moons ago. Soon the spring that feeds your land will run dry." "That's why he's so confident I'll sell," Grace realized, anger replacing her initial shock. "He's not waiting for the bank to foreclose. He's making sure I have no choice but to leave." "There is more," Dohasan said grimly. "Follow me." He led her to the far side of the plateau, where a trail descended into a hidden canyon. As they made their way down, Grace began to hear the lowing of cattle. Many cattle. When they reached a vantage point overlooking the canyon floor, she gasped at the sight below. At least 50 head of cattle grazed in the sheltered canyon, and among them, Grace recognized several bearing her own brand. "My cattle," she breathed. "All the missing ones. They've been here all along." "Yes," Dohasan confirmed. "James's men bring more each week. They keep them here until they can be moved to his main herd without suspicion." Grace's mind raced with the implications. "If I could prove this, if I could get the sheriff to see—" "The white man's law moves slowly," Dohasan interrupted, "and James has many friends among your leaders. By the time justice came, your land would already be lost." He was right, Grace knew. The territorial courts were notoriously slow, and James's influence reached far beyond the local community. Even with evidence of his crimes, she might not get resolution before the bank took her ranch. "There is another way," Dohasan said quietly, watching her face. "My people move north to winter hunting grounds beyond the white man's territory. There is good land there and peace." He paused, his eyes holding hers intently. "You could come with me." The offer hung in the air between them, momentous in its implications. Grace stared at him, stunned by the suggestion and by the surge of longing it provoked in her heart. "Leave everything?" she whispered. "My home, my ranch, my—" She stopped, realizing that the word she had been about to say was life, but in truth, what life remained for her here? Endless struggle against forces determined to see her fail, loneliness and suspicion from neighbors who had once been friends. It would not be easy, Dohasan acknowledged. The journey is hard, and life among my people harder still for a white woman. But you would be respected for your courage and skill. His voice softened. And you would not be alone. The unspoken meaning behind his words was clear. They had been circling each other for weeks, neither willing to put a name to the connection growing between them. Now, Dohasan had laid it bare. Not just an offer of sanctuary, but of a future together. I need time to think, Grace said finally, overwhelmed by the choice before her. This isn't a decision I can make in a moment. Dohasan nodded, accepting her hesitation without offense. My band leaves with the next full moon, 7 days from now. If you choose to come, meet me at Dawn's Hollow, the canyon where the 3 lightning-struck pines stand together. He paused. If you do not come, I will understand, and I will still find a way to help you save your land. The ride back to her wagon was made in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts of what the future might hold. As they approached the spot where Grace had left her team, Dohasan suddenly raised his hand in warning, drawing his horse to a halt. Someone has been here, he said, his voice low and tense. Grace scanned the area, seeing nothing amiss at first. Then she noticed the tracks, fresh hoof prints circling her hidden wagon. Someone had found it, examined it, and departed. The cowboys, she suggested. Dohasan shook his head. Military boots, the soldiers have been here. A chill ran through Grace. Looking for me, or for you? Both, perhaps. Dohasan's expression was grim. They will have seen 2 sets of tracks leaving. One barefoot horse, yours, one shod in the Apache way, mine. They'll know I was with an Apache, Grace realized, her stomach sinking. They might be waiting at the ranch right now. Dohasan made a swift decision. I will create a false trail to draw them away from your land. You return home as if nothing is wrong. If they question you, say your horse escaped and you went searching on foot. Will they believe that? They will believe what they wish to believe, Dohasan replied. Some will suspect, but without proof they cannot act against you. Grace knew he was right. Without catching them together, the soldiers had only circumstantial evidence of her association with Dohasan. But the risk was growing with each encounter. Be careful, she urged him. If they catch you, they will not, he assured her with quiet confidence. I have evaded white soldiers since I was a boy. Before she could respond, he leaned from his horse and took her face in his hands, the gesture so unexpected that Grace froze in surprise. For a heartbeat, they remained thus, his dark eyes searching hers as if memorizing every detail. Then, with gentle deliberation, he pressed his lips to her forehead, not quite a kiss, more like a blessing. 7 days, he murmured against her skin, Dawn's Hollow. Whatever you decide, know that you have earned the respect of Dohasan and his people. Then he was gone, his horse melting into the landscape with uncanny swiftness, leaving Grace to stare after him with her heart pounding and her thoughts in turmoil. The ranch was quiet when she returned, no sign of soldiers or other visitors. Hank helped her unload the supplies, his expression concerned as he noted her distraction. You all right, Mrs. Adams? He asked. You seem far away. Grace managed a smile. Just tired, Hank. It's been a long day. That night she sat at her small writing desk and made 2 columns on a sheet of paper. In one she listed all the reasons to stay and fight for her ranch, her history with Thomas, the years of work invested, her legal rights to the land and water, the principle of not being driven out by injustice. In the other column, she wrote the stark realities: the bank's deadline, James's theft of her cattle and diversion of her water, the increasing hostility from neighbors, the isolation and vulnerability of her position. And beneath these practical considerations lay the unwritten truth that she hardly dared acknowledge even to herself, her growing feelings for Dohasan, feelings that defied every convention of the society in which she had been raised, yet felt more genuine than anything she had experienced since Thomas's death. The choice before her was impossible, a brutal equation with no correct answer. Stay, and almost certainly lose everything to forces beyond her control. Or leave with Dohasan, abandoning the life she had built but perhaps finding something new and unexpected in its place. 7 days to decide. 7 days that would determine the course of her future. Dawn found Grace already awake, having slept little. She moved through her morning chores mechanically, her mind still wrestling with the decision that loomed before her. As she fed the chickens in the yard, the sound of approaching riders snapped her back to the present. Lieutenant Marshall's patrol crested the rise, but this time they were accompanied by a civilian whose identity made Grace's blood run cold. Randall James himself, patriarch of the neighboring ranch and architect of her current misfortune. Beside him rode Bradley James, his smug expression suggesting that whatever brought them to her door this morning, it would not end well for Grace Adams. Grace squared her shoulders as Randall James, his son Bradley and Lieutenant Marshall's patrol approached her ranch house. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, the air still cool with the promise of a day that would change everything. "Mrs. Adams?" Randall James called, his deep voice carrying easily across the distance. Unlike his son's sneering condescension, the elder James projected an aura of absolute authority, a man accustomed to bending others to his will. "I believe we have matters to discuss." "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. James," Grace replied, standing her ground at the foot of her porch steps. Behind her, she heard Hank emerge from the barn, the subtle click of his rifle being readied a small comfort. James dismounted with surprising agility for a man of his years and bulk. Lieutenant Marshall followed suit, while the soldiers remained mounted, forming a loose semicircle that effectively blocked any route of escape. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say," James insisted, approaching until he stood just a few paces from her. "Lieutenant Marshall has shared some disturbing information with me, information that as a leading citizen of this territory I cannot ignore." "And what information would that be?" Grace asked, though she already knew. "That you've been consorting with Apache," James said bluntly. "Harboring enemies of the territory, aiding those who murder innocent settlers." He shook his head in exaggerated disappointment. "I always knew Thomas Adams showed poor judgment in his dealings with the Indians, but I never thought his widow would sink so low." Grace felt her temper flare at the mention of her husband. "Thomas showed respect to all people regardless of their race, a concept you might find foreign, Mr. James." "Respect is earned," James countered, "and savages who raid, kidnap, and murder have earned nothing but the rope." He gestured to Lieutenant Marshall. "Show her what you found." Marshall produced a leather pouch, opening it to reveal several items: Dohasan's beaded wristband, a small carved stone eagle he had given her, and most damning of all, a scrap of paper with crude drawings. A map Grace had sketched, showing the location of the hidden canyon where her stolen cattle were being kept. "Found these hidden in your barn?" Marshall said, his tone suggesting he was performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Along with tracks showing regular visits by an Apache rider, the evidence is conclusive, Mrs. Adams." "Evidence of what?" Grace challenged. "That I traded for some native crafts? That I've been tracking my stolen cattle?" "Evidence of treason," James pronounced with finality. "Aiding hostiles during time of conflict is a hanging offense." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Grace felt her mouth go dry, but she kept her expression defiant. "You've manufactured these charges because you want my land. Everyone knows it. Your land will be forfeit regardless," James said dismissively. "The banknote comes due in less than 2 months, and you haven't the means to pay it." "Unless I could recover my stolen cattle," Grace countered. "The cattle your men have been rustling for months." A flash of surprise crossed James's face, quickly masked by practiced indifference. A desperate accusation from a desperate woman. "Do you have any proof of these alleged thefts?" "I've seen your hidden canyon," Grace said boldly. "I've counted my branded cattle among your herd. I know about the dam you've built to divert water from my spring." For the first time, James appeared genuinely taken aback. His eyes narrowed as he reassessed her. "And who showed you these things? Your Apache friend, I presume?" He smiled coldly. "Thank you for confirming your relationship with the enemy." Grace realized too late she'd been maneuvered into a trap. By admitting knowledge of the canyon, she'd all but confirmed she'd been with Dohasan. "Lieutenant," James continued, "I believe you have sufficient cause to take Mrs. Adams into custody, pending formal charges." Marshall hesitated, glancing at Grace. "Sir, she's a white woman and a widow of a veteran. The territorial governor might—" "The governor is my personal friend," James interrupted. "Faye will understand the necessity of making an example. The Apache must learn that those who aid them will receive no mercy, regardless of their sex or station." As Marshall reluctantly reached for the manacles at his belt, A shot rang out, kicking up dust at the lieutenant's feet. Everyone froze, turning toward the source of the gunfire. Hank stood at the corner of the barn, his rifle raised and ready for a second shot. "Next one won't miss," he called. "The lady ain't going nowhere with you." Marshall's hand moved to his sidearm, but James stopped him with a gesture. "There's no need for bloodshed, Williams," he called to Hank. "You're only making things worse for Mrs. Adams." "Way I see it," Hank replied, "things can't get much worse. You're framing her for crimes she didn't commit so you can steal her land." "I'm enforcing the law," James insisted, "and unless you want to hang alongside her, I suggest you lower that rifle." The tense standoff was broken by the sound of galloping hooves. All heads turned to see a lone rider approaching from the direction of town, Sheriff Wilson, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "What's going on here, James?" the sheriff demanded as he reined his horse to a stop. "Got word you were heading out to the Adams place with soldiers. Last I checked, civil matters fall under my jurisdiction, not the Army's." James's expression soured. "This is a military matter, Sheriff. Mrs. Adams has been consorting with hostile Apache." The sheriff dismounted, his weathered face revealing nothing. "That's so? And what proof do you have of these serious charges?" Lieutenant Marshall showed him the items found in the barn. The sheriff examined them thoughtfully, then turned to Grace. "These yours, Mrs. Adams?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "The crafts are mine, purchased legally. The map I drew while tracking my stolen cattle." "Stolen by whom?" "By Randall James," Grace said clearly. "His men have been rustling my cattle for months and keeping them in a hidden canyon east of here. He's also damming the river to cut off water to my land, trying to force me to sell." The sheriff whistled softly. "Those are mighty serious accusations against a prominent citizen." "She has no proof," James said dismissively. "Just the word of her Apache conspirator." Sheriff Wilson's eyes narrowed. "Actually, she might have more than that." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded document. "Had an interesting visitor last night, young cowboy named Martinez who used to work for you, James. Seems he developed a conscience about certain activities he was ordered to participate in." He unfolded the paper, revealing a signed affidavit. "According to Martinez, you've been systematically stealing cattle from smaller ranches and diverting water illegally. He's provided locations, dates, names of the men involved." The sheriff's gaze hardened. "Enough evidence to warrant a full investigation by the Territorial Marshal's office." James's face flushed with rage. "Martinez is a disgruntled former employee. His word against mine counts for nothing." "Maybe not," the sheriff agreed, "but it's enough for me to insist that Mrs. Adams remain free until these matters are properly investigated." He turned to Lieutenant Marshall. "Unless you have direct evidence of her providing material support to hostile Apache, weapons, ammunition, information about military movements, these trinkets don't justify an arrest." Marshall looked uncomfortable, caught between James's influence and the sheriff's legal authority. "We have reports of an Apache warrior visiting her ranch," he said reluctantly, "but no direct evidence of treasonous activity." "Then I suggest you return to your patrol," Sheriff Wilson said firmly. "I'll handle any civil matters concerning Mrs. Adams." For a moment it seemed James might challenge the sheriff's authority. Then, with calculated restraint, he nodded. "Very well. But this isn't over, Adams. The bank will still take your ranch, and no amount of false accusations against me will change that." As James, his son, and the patrol departed, Grace felt light-headed with relief. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said quietly. Wilson removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Don't thank me yet. James is right about one thing. He has powerful friends. This investigation could take months, and your banknote comes due much sooner." "I know," Grace acknowledged, "but at least I have a chance now." The sheriff nodded, his expression grave. "I'll do what I can to recover your cattle if we find them where Martinez claims, but James won't take this lying down. You should be prepared for trouble." After the sheriff departed, Grace sat heavily on her porch steps, the morning's confrontation leaving her drained. Hank brought her a cup of coffee, his weathered face creased with concern. "What now, Mrs. Adams?" Grace stared into the distance, where dust still rose from the departing riders. "Now we prepare, Hank. One way or another, everything changes when the full moon rises." The next 5 days passed in a flurry of activity. With the sheriff's permission, Grace and Hank rode to the hidden canyon and identified 15 head of cattle bearing her brand. It wasn't all of her stolen stock, but it was enough to make a difference if she could recover them legally. The territorial marshal arrived to document the evidence, promising swift action but warning that the legal process would still take time. Meanwhile, Grace made quiet preparations for another possibility. She sorted through her belongings, setting aside the few precious items that could be carried on horseback: her mother's silver locket, Thomas's letters, a small book of poetry they had read together in the early days of their marriage. Practical items, too: warm clothing, her good knife, medicines, seeds that might grow in new soil. On the sixth night, as Grace sat on her porch watching the nearly full moon rise over the eastern hills, Hank joined her with 2 cups of coffee. "You're leaving?" he said. It wasn't a question. Grace turned to him, surprised. "How did you know?" The old ranch hand smiled sadly. "Been watching you sort and pack for days. Besides, I know that look. Saw it on Thomas's face when he decided to head west. It's the look of someone who's made up their mind to chase the horizon." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "I haven't decided for certain," she said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "The Apache," Hank said gently. "He asked you to go with him, didn't he?" Grace nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "And you love him," Hank continued. It wasn't a question either. "Yes," Grace whispered, the admission both frightening and freeing. "Heaven help me, I do." Hank sipped his coffee, looking thoughtful. "Thomas wouldn't begrudge you finding happiness again, you know. He wasn't the jealous type." "It's not just that," Grace said. "It's who Dohasan is. What people would think. What it would mean for both of us." "People will always find reasons to judge," Hank replied with the wisdom of his years. "But at the end, we answer for the lives we actually lived, not the ones others thought we should." He set down his cup. "If you go, I'll look after things here. The sheriff thinks we have a good case against James. If it works out, maybe you could come back someday." Grace reached out, squeezing his gnarled hand. "And if it doesn't?" Hank shrugged. "Then I'll see the ranch get sold to someone who'll treat it right. Not James or his ilk." He paused. "Unless you'd rather I followed along later like we discussed. Reckon I could find your Apache camp eventually." The offer touched Grace deeply. "You'd do that? Leave everything you know to live among the Apache?" "Ain't got much keeping me here," Hank admitted. "And I promised Thomas I'd look after you. Can't very well do that if you're hundreds of miles away." That night, Grace finally slept soundly. The weight of indecision lifted from her shoulders. When dawn broke, she rose and dressed with quiet purpose, packing the last of her selected belongings into saddlebags. Hank helped her saddle her best horse, neither of them speaking much as they worked. When everything was ready, he handed her a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "Thomas's service pistol," he explained, "cleaned and loaded. The frontier ain't safe, even with an Apache warrior at your side." Grace took the weapon, touched by his foresight. "Thank you, Hank, for everything. You just take care of yourself," he replied gruffly, blinking rapidly. "And if things go south here, expect company before the first snow." With a final embrace, Grace mounted her horse and rode away from the ranch that had been her home and her prison for the past 3 years. She didn't look back, focusing instead on the path ahead that would take her to Dawn's Hollow and to Dohasan. The journey took most of the day, the trail growing increasingly rugged as she climbed into the foothills. By late afternoon, Grace reached the landmark Dohasan had described, 3 lightning-struck pines standing sentinel at the entrance to a secluded canyon. As she guided her horse into the shadow of the towering rocks, uncertainty gripped her. What if he wasn't there? What if his band had already departed, unable to wait any longer? What if... Her doubts vanished as she rounded a bend and saw him. Dohasan sat motionless on a flat rock overlooking a small spring, as if he had been waiting precisely there since they parted. At the sound of her approach, he rose and turned, his stoic features softening at the sight of her. "You came," he said simply, the words carrying a wealth of emotion. Grace dismounted, her legs unsteady after the long ride, or perhaps from the magnitude of what she was doing. "I came." They stood facing each other, the decision made but its implications still settling between them. Grace was acutely aware that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. "Are you certain?" Dohasan asked, his dark eyes searching hers. "The path ahead is difficult." "I'm certain," Grace replied, finding strength in the words as she spoke them. My life at the ranch was coming to an end one way or another. This way, at least, I choose my own fate. Dohasan nodded, respect and something deeper warming his gaze. My people wait in the high valley beyond these hills. We travel north with tomorrow's dawn. He hesitated, then added, Some will not welcome you at first. They fear the white man's ways. I understand, Grace said. I'll earn their trust as you've earned mine. They made camp by the spring, sharing a simple meal as twilight descended. When darkness fell, Dohasan built up the fire against the growing chill, then seated himself beside Grace. In my tribe, he said quietly, when a man and woman decide to join their lives, they speak their intentions beneath the open sky, with only the stars as witnesses. No ceremony is needed beyond their true words to each other. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken at the implication. And what words do they speak? Dohasan took her hands in his touch gentle yet strong. They speak of what they see in each other, of why they choose one another above all others. His voice deepened. I choose you, Grace Adams, because you have the courage of a warrior and the compassion of a healer. Because you see me as I am, not as your people's fears would paint me. Because when I am with you, I feel that my two worlds, Apache and white, can exist together in peace. Tears welled in Grace's eyes at the simple poetry of his words. And I choose you, Dohasan, because you've shown me what true strength is. Not domination, but protection. Because you respect my independence, even as you offer your support. Because with you, I feel not like Thomas's widow or the stubborn rancher, but simply myself, a woman ready to love again. Dohasan reached up, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. There is one question that must be asked and answered with complete truth, he said solemnly. Without this, no union can stand strong against the storms to come. Grace nodded, sensing the importance of the moment. Ask me. Dohasan's eyes held hers, firelight reflecting in their depths. Tell me it's true, he said softly. Tell me you love me. The question hung in the air between them, stripped of all pretense or evasion. Grace felt the last of her reservations fall away as she answered from the deepest part of her heart. It's true, she whispered. I love you, more than I thought possible. The Apache smiled, a full, radiant smile that transformed his solemn features. More than life itself, he replied, echoing her sentiment as he drew her into his embrace. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the passion of a connection that had defied prejudice, danger, and the vast differences of their worlds. When they finally parted, both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Dawn found them already prepared to travel, their few possessions loaded onto their horses. As the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern mountains, they rode side by side out of the canyon and toward the high valley where Dohasan's people waited. What will happen to Hank? Dohasan asked, as they climbed a rocky trail. And your ranch? Hank will stay to see through the case against James, Grace explained. If it succeeds, he'll sell the ranch to someone deserving and follow our trail north before winter. If not, she shrugged, he'll come anyway, with whatever he can salvage. Dohasan looked surprised. The old one would leave his world to join ours. He promised my husband he'd look after me, Grace said with a fond smile. Hank takes such promises seriously. Then we will welcome him, Dohasan decided. My people respect those who honor their word. As they crested a rise, the valley spread before them, a hidden paradise of green meadows bordered by protective cliffs, a clear stream winding through its center. Teepees dotted the landscape, and in the distance Grace could see people moving about their morning tasks. Her future. Are you afraid? Dohasan asked, noting her expression as she gazed at the encampment. Grace considered the question honestly. Yes, she admitted, but not enough to turn back. Dohasan reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. That, he said with quiet pride, is why you will thrive among my people. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to continue despite it. Hand in hand, they rode down into the valley, two people from different worlds who had found in each other something rare and precious. Behind them lay the ranch, the territory, and all the constraints of the society Grace had known. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, and the promise of a life built on love rather than convention. As they approached the camp and curious faces turned to watch their arrival, Grace straightened in her saddle, her chin lifted with the same determination that had once helped her face down Randall James and his men. Whatever came next, she would meet it with courage, secure in the knowledge that she had chosen her own path. And beside her rode Dohasan, proud warrior and gentle soul, who had crossed boundaries as profound as she had to find a love that transcended the divisions of their time. Together, they would forge a new way forward, not fully of either world, but creating something unique between them. "Ready?" Dohasan asked softly as they neared the first teepees. Grace squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Ready." The morning sun bathed the valley in golden light as they rode the final distance, two silhouettes merging into one shared future beneath the vast Arizona sky. The end. Dear listener, as Grace and Dohasan's story draws to a close, I find myself reflecting on the courage it takes to choose our own path, especially later in life when the world expects us to settle for what we have, rather than reach for what we desire. Their journey across boundaries of culture, expectation, and fear speaks to something universal in all of us, the yearning for connection that transcends the artificial limits others place upon our hearts. Like Grace, many of us have faced crossroads where the comfortable path leads back to the familiar, while the uncertain one beckons with the promise of genuine fulfillment. You who have lived through decades of experiences know better than most that life's richest chapters aren't always written in our youth. Sometimes the most profound love, the deepest understanding, and the truest courage emerge when our hair has silvered and our faces show the map of years we've traveled. Perhaps you felt like Grace at times, standing at the edge of your own property, wondering if there might be something more beyond the boundaries you've accepted. Or maybe you've been like Dohasan, bridging two worlds and finding that your greatest strength lies in embracing both parts of yourself rather than choosing between them. The desert nights that wrapped around our characters offer the same wisdom available to you. In stillness and solitude, we often find our clearest truths. When Grace finally admitted to herself that she loved Dohasan, it wasn't a surrender of her past, but an honoring of her present heart, a lesson that it's never too late to acknowledge what brings us alive. As you rest tonight, know that the courage displayed in our story resides in you as well. The power to redefine your days, to choose joy over obligation, to stand firm in your own truth. These aren't qualities that diminish with age, but rather grow more refined, like gold tested in fire. Let the peace of the Arizona sky in our tale spread over your evening. Let the strength of characters who defied convention reassure you that your own convictions are worth honoring. And as you drift into sleep, may you be wrapped in the same protective embrace that Dohasan offered Grace, the certainty that you are valued, respected, and worthy of every happiness, no matter what chapter of life you're currently living. The horizon always beckons, even when our trails seem well worn. And sometimes the bravest choice is simply to admit what our hearts have known all along, that love, in its many forms, remains our truest compass. Rest well tonight. Stand tall tomorrow. Your story continues to unfold in ways just as meaningful as any told around a crackling fire under the vast western sky. With deepest gratitude, Wild West Whispers team, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Every gesture of support helps us stay motivated to bring you more stories of love, healing, and second chances. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another emotional story from our channel. Click and be surprised by more unforgettable tales like this one.